Los Angeles, the city of angels, dreams, and untold wars. What if beneath its glittering skyline, a silent empire of blood and power was rising again? In today's episode, we uncover the hidden truth behind the return of Mara Salvatrucha, the gang that turned fear into order and violence into currency. Stay until the end to discover the shocking reality the media won't show you. Subscribe, comment your thoughts below, and join our community that dares to face what others deny. There was a time when Los Angeles believed it had conquered its demons. Police operations, federal indictments, and mass deportations had, supposedly, dismantled the gang that once ruled the shadows, Mara Salvatrucha. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the calm before the next storm, an illusion built on statistics and political speeches. The city's streets, Pico Union, Westlake, MacArthur Park, had been scrubbed clean of graffiti and bullet holes, yet the smell of fear still lingered in the air. In those forgotten alleys, the gang that was meant to be extinct was slowly breathing again, reorganizing in whispers, one block at a time. The story of their return didn't start with violence. It began with absence, an absence of opportunity, belonging, and faith in the system. After the early 2000s crackdown, thousands of young men with tattoos of skulls and devil horns were deported to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. But deportation didn't erase loyalty, it transplanted it. What was once a Los Angeles problem became a Central American export, and then, like a boomerang, it came back. The United States had outsourced the disease only to see it mutate and return with a vengeance. From prisons in San Salvador to safe houses in Los Angeles, the communication never stopped. Letters, encrypted calls, and secret codes kept the hierarchy alive. By the mid-2010s, immigration routes were opening again. Families fleeing the chaos of Central America brought with them more than desperation. They brought survival instincts shaped by war and violence. Among them were old members seeking refuge and young recruits looking for identity in a country that treated them as invisible. The streets of Los Angeles, always hungry for power struggles, became fertile ground once more. The new clickers, smaller cells of MS-13, didn't act recklessly like their predecessors. They learned from the past. They studied police behavior, used encrypted apps, and adopted a quieter strategy. Their violence was surgical, selective, and symbolic. No more drive-bys in broad daylight. Now the message was delivered in silence. A body found in an alley, a warning whispered to a business owner, a symbol drawn on a wall at night. Local authorities were slow to see it. For years, they believed the gang was fractured beyond repair. But on the ground, something darker was happening. Old alliances were rekindling, and new players were entering the game. The Barrio 18 and MS-13 conflicts that had defined the 1990s returned, this time intertwined with the drug trade, human trafficking, and transnational extortion networks. Money flowed from the streets of Los Angeles to San Salvador, funding a violent machine that was both local and global. The war for control was no longer just territorial, it was economic, digital, and deeply psychological. Investigators began to notice patterns, murders that seemed personal but were orchestrated, missing persons whose names disappeared from reports, teenagers vanishing from shelters and schools. The FBI's Los Angeles field office launched a new wave of investigations under Operation Raging Bull and Project Lone Star, targeting the resurgence of MS-13. Yet for every arrest, two new leaders appeared in the shadows. The organization had evolved beyond the traditional gang structure. It was now a network, a living organism that adapted, regenerated, and learned. But the most haunting aspect of their return wasn't just the killings, it was the silence surrounding them. Immigrant communities, long traumatized by both gang violence and law enforcement, preferred not to speak. In neighborhoods like Koreatown and Westlake, fear became a kind of social contract. You didn't look, you didn't ask, and you certainly didn't talk. Businesses paid rent to stay open. Churches quietly negotiated protection. Even local politicians, desperate to avoid racial tensions, framed the issue as isolated crime. The silence was complicity, and it allowed the roots to grow deeper. For the people living inside this hidden reality, daily life became a negotiation with fear. A mother walking her son to school would take different streets each day, pretending it was a game. A shop owner would leave cash in an envelope by the trash bin rather than face the men who collected it. A pastor would preach about redemption, even as he knew some of his congregants were killers by night. Los Angeles was living two realities, the one on camera and the one buried beneath it. Behind this resurgence was a new kind of leadership, younger, more educated, less visible. They didn't tattoo their faces. They wore hoodies, used smartphones, and knew how to vanish online. They spoke fluent English and Spanish, moved between cities, and treated the gang less like a brotherhood and more like a business. Their loyalty wasn't just to the Mara, it was to power itself. This new generation saw violence not as chaos, but as currency. Each murder was a message, each disappearance was a transaction. Journalists who tried to investigate this rebirth faced threats and intimidation. In 2022, several independent reporters from California-based outlets received anonymous messages after publishing stories connecting Los Angeles violence to MS-13 operations in El Salvador. One reporter found her car burned. Another received a note that simply said, "Don't dig graves you can't fill." The line between journalism and survival became thin, and once again, truth was silenced by fear. For the US government, the challenge was no longer just policing, it was perception. How do you convince a city that claims to be thriving under the Hollywood sun that it's still haunted by ghosts from its own alleys? The resurgence of MS-13 forced America to face an uncomfortable truth. Violence doesn't die when you deport it. It migrates, adapts, and returns. And Los Angeles, the City of Angels, had unknowingly become its sanctuary once again. The final image of this chapter is cinematic, a night shot of downtown Los Angeles, lights shimmering across the skyline. Beneath the surface, hidden in the labyrinth of alleys and forgotten neighborhoods, the heartbeat of Mara Salvatrucha pulses quietly, methodically, waiting for its moment. The camera pans slowly over a wall covered with fresh graffiti, 3 letters carved in white and black. Mess. The symbol isn't loud, but it's alive, and it marks the beginning of something the city thought it had buried forever, the silent return. Before the tattoos, before the headlines, before the horror stories that made suburban America tremble, Mara Salvatrucha was not a monster. It was a symptom. To understand its birth, you have to return to the 1980s, a decade when the streets of Los Angeles became the collision point between war and survival, between exile and identity. During those years, the US was watching Central America burn. In El Salvador, a brutal civil war pitted leftist guerrillas against a US-backed military regime. Death squads patrolled villages, children were trained as soldiers, and entire families disappeared in the night. Between 1979 and 1992, more than 75,000 people were killed. For thousands of Salvadorans, Honduras and Guatemala were no longer home. They were graves, and so they fled. They walked north through jungles and deserts, crossed rivers and borders, and arrived in Los Angeles with little more than their fear and memories. But when they reached the City of Angels, the welcome was cold. There were no refugee protections for Salvadorans because the US didn't officially recognize the war as a conflict it had helped fuel. Instead, these refugees were labeled illegal aliens. They settled in poor neighborhoods already drowning in poverty, violence, and racial tension, places like Pico Union and Westlake, where African American, Mexican, and Asian communities were already fighting for survival. The Salvadorans brought nothing but their will to exist, yet they were treated like intruders. In this fractured environment, young Salvadoran boys, children of war, many of whom had seen their families executed or their homes destroyed, found themselves isolated and despised. They didn't fit in with Mexican gangs who mocked their accents and saw them as outsiders. They didn't belong to the American system either, which ignored them completely. So they did what human beings always do when they have no tribe. They built one. Out of fear, rage, and memory, they created La Mara Salvatrucha. The word Mara came from marabunta, a term used in Central America to describe a swarm of deadly ants that destroy everything in their path. Salvatrucha was a combination of Salvadoran pride, salva, and a street term meaning clever or alert, trucha. Together, the name meant more than just a gang. It was a declaration: we exist. We are not afraid. At first, the group was small, just a few dozen teenagers banding together to protect each other from other gangs, particularly the Mexican Mafia and the 18th Street Gang, Barrio 18. But protection quickly turned into aggression. Years of trauma and violence had wired these young men to respond with brutality. Many had grown up watching soldiers torture civilians or rebels execute traitors. They knew no other form of authority but fear. When they were mocked or threatened, they retaliated with military precision. They carried machetes instead of guns, wore long hair, and spoke in a strange blend of Spanish and English that would later become the unique dialect of the Mara. By the late 1980s, Los Angeles was a cauldron of gang warfare. Crack cocaine had flooded the streets. The LAPD, led by Chief Daryl Gates, was conducting aggressive sweeps that often criminalized entire communities. In this chaos, Mara Salvatrucha found its identity through opposition. They weren't just fighting other gangs, they were fighting invisibility. Every tattoo, every act of violence was a scream to a world that refused to hear them. The gang grew fast, absorbing other Central American youths, Hondurans, Guatemalans, and Nicaraguans, who shared the same background of displacement and pain. Their initiation rituals became infamous. New recruits were beaten by 13 members for 13 seconds, symbolizing loyalty, endurance, and the number that would forever define them. 13. Over time, MS-13 established cliques in different neighborhoods, each with its own rules but bound by one code: loyalty above life. In prisons, their identity solidified. The California prison system, overcrowded and racially segregated, became a breeding ground for organization. Inside those walls, alliances were formed with the Mexican Mafia, or La M, giving the Salvadorans access to protection, drug routes, and hierarchy. But this alliance came at a cost. The 13 in MS-13 was added as a sign of allegiance to La M. This connection gave the gang credibility and structure, turning what was once a local group into a disciplined criminal organization. Yet, outside prison, the world was shifting. In the early 1990s, as the Cold War ended, the U.S. began deporting thousands of undocumented immigrants convicted of crimes. Among them were hundreds of MS-13 members. Many were sent back to El Salvador, a country still traumatized and rebuilding after the Civil War. They returned like ghosts of America, tattooed, fluent in street English, and trained in the codes of U.S. gang life. El Salvador was not ready for them. There were no jobs, no rehabilitation programs, no hope. What began as a survival strategy in Los Angeles now became a contagion across Central America. The deported members rebuilt their clickers there, spreading the culture of violence like wildfire. Within a decade, MS-13 had become a transnational network spanning from Los Angeles to San Salvador, Tegucigalpa, and Guatemala City. The war-torn generation had given birth to a new kind of war, one without borders, driven not by ideology, but by power and fear. Back in Los Angeles, the cycle continued. The children of those original refugees, born in America but raised amid trauma, carried the same anger. The police called them criminals. The media called them animals. But beneath every act of brutality was a simple truth. These were the sons of a forgotten war, fighting ghosts that no one else could see. Sociologists like Sonia Wolf and anthropologists like Deborah Levinson have written that gangs like MS-13 are social institutions in the absence of the state. In other words, when society abandons its people, the gang becomes the government. It provides belonging, order, punishment, and protection, all the things the real system failed to give. The seeds of Mara Salvatrucha were planted in blood and neglect. The United States tried to suppress it with arrests, deportations, and fear, but you cannot kill what you helped create. The 1980s and 1990s forged an identity stronger than any border wall could stop. By the time politicians began to notice, it was too late. The fire had already spread, and so what started as a few scared boys in Pico Union became one of the most feared names in the world. Mara Salvatrucha, a creation born from war, hardened by exile, and resurrected by the same systems that tried to bury it. Every act of violence that would later terrorize Los Angeles, New York, and beyond traces back to those first lonely nights when a group of abandoned refugees swore to protect each other. In the distance, you can almost hear the echo of that promise, whispered in Spanish, echoing across the decades. Somos la Mara, somos familia, nadie nos toca. We are the Mara. We are family. No one touches us. By the time the sun sets over Los Angeles, the city transforms. The light fades into gold, then into shadows, and what looks like silence from above hides a network of unspoken terror below. Between the cracked walls of Koreatown and the graffiti-covered alleys of MacArthur Park, another city awakens, one that doesn't exist on maps or news briefings. It's the invisible empire of Mara Salvatrucha, and in this world, silence is the only language that guarantees survival. In 2020, the Los Angeles Times published an investigative report that few dared to follow up. It spoke of ritual killings, coded messages, and a new breed of MS-13 cells operating with surgical precision. One case stood out: the discovery of 6 bodies in Elysian Valley, all bearing the same signs, their hands bound, a single bullet to the head, and a carved letter M near the chest. Detectives called it an initiation, but inside the neighborhoods, people knew better. It wasn't initiation, it was communication. Each body was a message, each killing a punctuation mark in the gang's reassertion of control. The MS-13 of this new era was not the chaotic, impulsive gang of the 1990s. It had evolved into something colder, more strategic. Violence had become its dialect of power. The cliques now operated like autonomous cells connected by invisible lines to Central America, each commanded by leaders known as palabreros, the word keepers. These men didn't need to show their faces. Their orders traveled through voice notes, coded WhatsApp messages, or through intermediaries who never used names, only numbers. La palabra, the word, was law, and that word, in those years, was expansion. As law enforcement tightened its grip on drug routes, the gang diversified. Extortion, human trafficking, arms dealing, and local control over immigrant communities became their core business. But in neighborhoods like South Los Angeles, it was the small acts of control that defined their dominance. Every store, mechanic, taco stand, and apartment complex was part of an informal taxation system known as La Renta. You didn't pay taxes to the city, you paid them to the Mara, and the collectors came with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The FBI's Operation Raging Bull, launched in 2017 and still ongoing, revealed chilling testimonies from informants. One of them described how killings were filmed and sent to El Salvador as proof of loyalty. Another revealed a horrifying detail. Some murders were designed to imitate scenes from the Salvadoran Civil War. a way to remind members of their ancestral roots. The violence wasn't random. It was theatrical, ritualistic, symbolic, a twisted echo of the trauma that had once created them. Among the names that emerged during those years was that of El Psycho, a young palabrero who had grown up in Los Angeles but spent his teenage years in a Salvadoran prison. He returned to California in 2018, more fluent in cruelty than in English. Under his command, the Fulton clique began a campaign of terror across the San Fernando Valley. Residents started finding mutilated animals left outside homes, gang tags painted in blood, and entire families disappearing overnight. When police finally raided one of his safe houses, they found a ledger, not of money but of names. Dozens of local residents, each marked with a letter: P for pagado, paid, N for nuevo, new target, and D for desaparecido. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is not the violence itself, it's how ordinary it became. Fear blended into routine. People learned to interpret silence as safety. When nights passed without gunshots, neighbors would whisper, "Hoy fue tranquilo." Today was quiet. The quiet meant that the Mara was still in control. It meant the system was functioning. It meant the rent had been paid and no one had broken the rules. In this inverted logic, peace was just another form of submission. Police forces faced an impossible challenge. In some areas, residents trusted the gang more than they trusted the authorities. The Mara enforced its own kind of order, brutal but consistent. A thief who robbed within their territory could be executed within 24 hours. A man who abused his wife might be beaten publicly. They called it justicia de barrio, neighborhood justice. It was swift, merciless, and hypocritically moral. "They are both the poison and the cure," said one LAPD detective in a 2023 interview. "They cause the chaos, then control it." Meanwhile, behind political curtains, Los Angeles officials struggled to balance image and truth. The city was booming. Tourism, film, and real estate industries were thriving. No one wanted to admit that just a few blocks away from the Walk of Fame, another kind of fame was being written in blood. And so, press releases downplayed the crisis. Gang-related incidents became the sanitized label for what was, in reality, a local war. Journalists who tried to expose it faced intimidation. In 2022, a freelance photographer named Luis Torres vanished after documenting gang funerals in East LA. His last photos, published posthumously, showed a group of masked young men standing over a coffin, holding machetes instead of flowers. Behind them, a wall bore 3 words sprayed in red: La palabra vive. The word lives. By then, MS-13 had woven itself into the city's fabric. You could find its fingerprints in high school corridors, construction sites, detention centers, and even social media accounts disguised as community pages. The gang was no longer an external enemy, it was an internal infection. Its members worked as delivery drivers, security guards, gardeners, and janitors, hiding in plain sight. They were invisible until they weren't. And yet, amid all this horror, there were cracks in the darkness, people who refused to surrender. A woman named Maribel, who ran a small grocery store in Westlake, became a silent hero in her neighborhood. She refused to pay rent, instead forming a hidden network of neighbors who helped one another report extortion anonymously. She received death threats, lost her brother to a drive-by, but never left. "If we all stay quiet," she once said in a local interview, "then they own us forever." Her story was brief, tragic, and powerful, a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to move. By 2024, the city's homicide statistics began to rise again, not dramatically, but steadily. Experts warned that these numbers were only the surface. For every body found, there were at least 3 that disappeared without record. The alleys of Los Angeles had become open graves of forgotten names, silent echoes of a war the city refused to acknowledge. The final image of this chapter is slow, haunting. A police drone flying over South LA at night. Below, narrow streets twist like veins. A flickering light exposes graffiti, freshly painted on a metal door. The letters MS, framed by wings. The wings of angels. The irony is suffocating. Because here, in the City of Angels, the angels have traded their halos for guns. If blood was the visible face of Mara Salvatrucha, money was its soul. For decades, the world viewed MS-13 through the lens of brutality, machetes, tattoos, and death. But behind the violence lay a hidden machinery, a network of influence that quietly infiltrated institutions, politics, and economies. The gang that was once dismissed as a street problem had learned to operate like a corporation, with profits, investments, and a silent hierarchy that reached far beyond Los Angeles. The transformation began in the shadows of prison cells. Inmates, many of them deported leaders from the early 2000s crackdowns, started developing a new strategy. They realized that chaos was good for fear, but order was better for business. In Salvadoran prisons like Izalco and Ciudad Barrios, Palabreros, the gang's strategists, began treating the organization like a transnational enterprise. Every clique in Los Angeles, Houston, or Long Island became a local branch, each sending money back to Central America. Extortion funds, drug profits, and remittances from illegal trafficking were laundered through seemingly legitimate fronts. Car washes, used car dealerships, restaurants, and even evangelical churches. FBI agents who worked on Operation Raging Bull uncovered evidence that MS-13 was moving millions of dollars annually through remittance channels indistinguishable from those used by law-abiding immigrants sending money to their families. One former agent described it bluntly: they hide their blood money inside the heart of the immigrant economy. It was genius in its cruelty, exploiting the same system that once abandoned them. In Los Angeles, the gang's control was no longer about territory alone. It was about influence. Politicians who sought to appear tough on crime occasionally found themselves negotiating indirectly with gang intermediaries through community programs, local peace councils, or donations to non-profits that operated in gang-controlled areas. It wasn't bribery in the traditional sense, it was symbiosis. The Mara controlled the neighborhoods the politicians needed to reach. In exchange for cooperation or silence, certain community leaders received favors, protection, financial aid, or votes. One LAPD intelligence report leaked in 2023 referred to this system as shadow governance. In some districts, the Mara acted as an unofficial municipal authority. They collected rent, enforced curfews, and mediated disputes between residents, all while maintaining strict obedience. When an immigrant family was robbed, they didn't call the police. They called the homeboy who ran the block. Justice was delivered faster, but at a price. That price was silence. The web didn't stop at the streets. From 2018 onward, MS-13 began experimenting with cryptocurrency to move money without banks. According to a 2022 Interpol briefing, gang associates used digital wallets and offshore exchanges to transfer funds between the US and Central America. The anonymity of the blockchain provided a perfect shield. Ironically, the same technology celebrated for financial freedom became a sanctuary for organized crime. And then came the political dimension. In El Salvador, the gang had already proven its power. Leaked documents revealed secret negotiations between the Salvadoran government and MS-13 leaders, pacts of peace in exchange for electoral advantage. The truce reduced homicides for a time, but allowed the gang to grow stronger internally. When the truce collapsed, it was too late. The Mara had already learned the ultimate lesson: power is not taken by force alone, it's traded. That lesson crossed borders. In Los Angeles, community activists and former gang members began warning that some anti-violence programs were being infiltrated by active members posing as reformers. They received city funding to run rehabilitation workshops while simultaneously funneling information and money to their cliques. The line between redemption and manipulation became blurred. To the public, they were success stories. In reality, they were brokers of influence. Inside this labyrinth, women played a crucial role, both as victims and as masterminds. The stereotype of MS-13 as a purely male army was no longer true. Female operatives handled money laundering, logistics, and communication. One woman, known only as La Secretaria, managed an entire network of safe houses stretching from Los Angeles to Tijuana. Her cover was flawless. She worked as a social worker during the day and coordinated money drops at night. Her calm efficiency earned her a nickname whispered even among FBI agents, the Accountant of Death. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized that the Mara had adopted a principle from its capitalist surroundings: diversification. Drugs were only one stream. They now invested in counterfeit goods, cybercrime, and human smuggling rings connected to cartels from Sinaloa and Jalisco. A 2023 Homeland Security report described MS-13's model as the franchise of violence. Each clique operated semi-independently, paying tribute to higher leadership while maintaining creative autonomy. Like local branches of a global brand. The brand was terror, but the management was business. And just as corporations have public relations strategies, so did the Mara. They sponsored local football teams, organized neighborhood cleanups, and distributed food during the pandemic. For residents who had no other support, the gang became a provider, a twisted form of social welfare. "They fed us when the government didn't," said one anonymous resident of Westlake in a 2022 interview. "I hate them, but I also owe them." This is the paradox that sustains their power. Fear and gratitude fused together. Behind the spectacle of violence, there was calculation. Every act of cruelty served a purpose. A public killing was not just punishment, it was branding. It reminded people who ruled the streets. The gang's logo, MS, became as recognizable in certain neighborhoods as the McDonald's arches or the Nike swoosh. Psychologically, it worked. When a symbol becomes part of your landscape, it ceases to shock you. It becomes reality. Meanwhile, law enforcement was trapped in bureaucracy. Raids and arrests continued, but cutting off one head only birthed another. The organization's decentralization made it nearly immune to traditional dismantling tactics. Even as FBI and DEA task forces celebrated record seizures, the gang's financial arm adapted. The money kept flowing, through churches, through cryptocurrencies, through the hands of clean intermediaries with no criminal record. The story of MS-13 is not just one of guns and blood. It's a mirror, reflecting how systems of power coexist. The same economic logic that drives corporations and governments also drives crime, efficiency, control, and invisibility. The Mara didn't invent corruption, it learned from it. It observed how politics rewarded secrecy and how profit justified anything. Then it imitated. Today, Los Angeles lives under a dual order. One visible, one invisible. The official city glows under Hollywood lights, its skyline shining as a symbol of prosperity. The other city exists in whispers and shadows, ruled by the logic of fear and the currency of loyalty. Between them runs a thin, trembling line. Cross it, and you'll find the truth. Power is never only in the hands of those who wear suits or carry guns. Sometimes it's held by those who learned how to control both. The camera fades out on the image of downtown at night. Bright towers above, darkness below. A single line of graffiti, freshly sprayed near an underpass, glows under flickering streetlights. El poder no se ve, se siente. Power isn't seen, it's felt. And in Los Angeles, that power still breathes in every alley, every envelope, every whispered name. By 2024, Los Angeles was no longer just a city, it was a war zone wearing makeup. Beneath the glitter of Hollywood, the palm-lined streets, and the glamour of endless summer, something was tearing through the city's veins. The war that officials insisted didn't exist had already begun. It wasn't declared on television or in press conferences. It started in whispers, in burned-out cars, in neighborhoods where police lights never came fast enough. The war for Los Angeles had no front lines, no uniforms, and no rules, but its casualties were everywhere. The first wave hit quietly. Inglewood, South Central, and the San Fernando Valley began seeing what police described as coordinated acts of aggression. Houses torched, businesses destroyed, entire families vanishing overnight. To the untrained eye, it looked like random violence, the kind that fills the nightly news cycle for 30 seconds before fading. But to those who lived inside these zones, the pattern was unmistakable. Mara Salvatrucha was cleaning house. The gang wasn't just fighting rivals anymore, it was rewriting its own map, eliminating internal traitors and asserting dominance over every inch of contested territory. The war wasn't only about land, it was about narrative. Control the story, and you control the city. In the era of social media, even violence became content. Videos began circulating on encrypted Telegram channels, masked figures standing before MS-13 symbols, reading messages directed at rivals like Barrio 18 and Florencia 13. "Los Angeles belongs to us again," one voice said in accented English. "We are the order in your chaos." The footage was low quality but effective. It spread fear faster than bullets ever could. Police intelligence later confirmed that these videos were part of a deliberate psychological campaign, digital propaganda designed to intimidate communities and recruit new members. The war was fought both on the streets and online. The same platforms where young people once posted dances and selfies now carried coded messages, warnings, and death threats. "If you're not with us," one caption read, "you're already against us." But rival gangs were not silent. Barrio 18, MS-13's oldest and most bitter enemy, struck back with equal ferocity. Drive-by shootings increased. Houses sprayed with the number 18 appeared across the same neighborhoods that once bore the MS tag. The violence turned cyclical, self-sustaining, almost ritualistic. A killing in one neighborhood triggered 3 more in another. It was revenge without end, feeding itself like fire in dry grass. Caught between these forces were the people. Shopkeepers, parents, schoolchildren, ordinary Angelenos who woke up each day uncertain whether they'd make it home. Streets that once buzzed with life emptied at sunset. Corner stores began closing early. Taxi drivers refused to enter certain districts. Even ambulances reported attacks, accused of helping one gang or the other. Fear became an unspoken curfew. Law enforcement agencies tried to regain control. The LAPD and federal task forces launched simultaneous raids across multiple districts. Helicopters hovered above night raids, their searchlights slicing through the darkness like accusations. Over 150 suspected gang members were arrested in a single week. The mayor declared it a victory against organized crime. But within days, the message arrived. 3 officers' cars set ablaze outside a precinct. A note left behind read simply, "For everyone you take, 2 will rise." Reporters who ventured into these zones described a surreal landscape. Blocks patrolled by armed teenagers, checkpoints run by gangs, mothers using coded knocks on doors to signal safety. "It's like we're living in another country," one resident of South Central told a journalist. "There's the city you see on TV, and then there's the city where we survive." Meanwhile, the drug corridors that once connected Los Angeles to Tijuana and Sinaloa became battlefields of their own. The Mara's alliance with certain cartel factions brought in more money and more enemies. Weapons flowed in from across the border, alongside synthetic drugs destined for American suburbs. The profits were astronomical, but the blood cost was higher. Every kilo that crossed meant another life erased. For the first time, the violence began spilling into the city's iconic spaces. A shooting near Venice Beach, a bombing in East Hollywood targeting a rival safehouse, graffiti near tourist landmarks. It was as if the underworld had decided to step into the daylight, daring authorities to deny its existence. "The Mara wants attention," said a senior FBI agent in an interview. "They want everyone to know they're not ghosts anymore. They're the landlords of fear." And yet, the deeper tragedy wasn't just the bloodshed, it was the indifference. For most of Los Angeles, the war was invisible. The entertainment industry kept producing stories about heroes and dreamers, while the real drama unfolded outside their studio gates. Politicians spoke in platitudes about community restoration, while funeral homes overflowed with unnamed bodies. Social media scrolled on, untouched, unbothered. Violence had become background noise, but not for everyone. In 2025, a grassroots coalition emerged in the heart of the chaos. Residents, teachers, pastors, and former gang members who called themselves La Voz del Pueblo, the people's voice. Their goal was simple: to reclaim their neighborhoods, not through violence, but through unity. They organized nighttime vigils, created safe spaces for children, and built community patrols that reported gang activity anonymously. For the first time in years, people began whispering hope. The gangs noticed. Hope was bad for business. Within weeks, several leaders of La Voz del Pueblo disappeared. One of them, Pastor Juan Morales, was found dead in an alley behind his church, his hands folded as if in prayer. A Bible lay beside him, open to the Gospel of Matthew. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." His murder sent shockwaves through the city, but it also galvanized others. The pastor's funeral turned into a march. Hundreds walked through the streets, chanting his name. For a moment, fear cracked and courage leaked through. Law enforcement began collaborating quietly with community leaders, using local networks to gather intelligence that traditional methods couldn't reach. By late 2025, dozens of mid-level operatives had been captured thanks to tip-offs from residents. It wasn't enough to end the war, but it was a shift, proof that silence could be broken. Still, the cost was staggering. Entire generations were lost, not to death, but to despair. Children grew up learning the geography of fear, which corners to avoid, which alleys belonged to which color, which nights to stay inside. The war had rewritten childhood itself. The final shot of this chapter is cinematic and cruelly ironic. A panoramic view of Los Angeles at dusk. The skyline glows, the freeways shimmer, and the city hums with life. But beneath the surface, in basements, in alleys, in the small forgotten homes between freeway overpasses, another Los Angeles breathes. A city ruled not by laws, but by the quiet rhythm of fear and survival. The war isn't over, it never was. It simply changes names, faces, and headlines. And in this city of angels, the wings are still burning. Dawn in Los Angeles feels like a lie. The first light spills over the Hollywood hills, bathing the skyline in gold, as if the night never happened. But the city beneath that glow still carries the bruises of darkness. Burned-out storefronts, alleys where whispers of gunfire linger, mothers counting the hours until their sons return home. After decades of blood, corruption, and silence, one question remains. Can Los Angeles ever be free? Or has the city learned to coexist with its own sickness, masking it with sunshine and calling it peace? For years, the answer seemed hopeless. The gang wars, the extortion networks, the betrayals, they became part of the city's rhythm, as common as traffic or smog. The institutions meant to protect the people often failed them, sometimes even colluded against them. Politicians came and went, promising reform, but offering bandages to wounds that went down to the bone. The truth is that Mara Salvatrucha and the darkness it represents didn't survive because of guns alone. It survived because the system itself needed it as an excuse, as a scapegoat, as a mirror. But something changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like light leaking through cracks. In neighborhoods like Westlake, Echo Park, and South Central, people began rediscovering what fear had stolen from them: community. Teachers opened after-school programs in old churches. Social workers risked their lives to reintegrate young offenders. Ex-gang members turned their own stories into warnings, not legends. Among them was José Tigre Ramos, once one of the most feared palabreros in Los Angeles. After serving 18 years in prison, he came out a different man. "I thought I was fighting for respect," he said in an interview. "But respect built on fear is just loneliness." Tigre began mentoring kids who reminded him of himself: angry, invisible, abandoned. He started a program called Second Word, a reference to the Mara's internal code, La Palabra, the word. His message was clear: you can change the word you live by. Slowly, other ex-members followed. Not many, but enough to spark something real. For the first time in years, some neighborhoods saw months without homicides. Sociologists studying Los Angeles gang culture call this the third wave, a generational shift where violence loses its glamour and exhaustion takes its place. After decades of endless war, even the killers grow tired. Children of gang members now look at their parents not as heroes, but as relics of a nightmare they refuse to repeat. It's a fragile hope, but it's there, like the faint hum of life after a long silence. Still, the illusion of freedom is dangerous. For every ex-member who finds redemption, 3 new recruits are waiting. Poverty hasn't disappeared. Deportations continue to tear families apart. Drugs still flow through the city's veins like anesthesia for pain too deep to name. And every new political cycle resets the narrative: progress, crackdown, reform. The same words rearranged, the same mistakes repainted. The city keeps pretending it can solve violence without solving inequality. In 2025, a special task force released a confidential report that later leaked to the press. Its conclusion was both simple and terrifying. Gangs will not die because they are not separate from society. They are its consequence. The report detailed how the same economic structures that produce billionaires also produce killers. The gap between them is not morality, but luck. When you grow up in a world that tells you survival is the only success, you learn to kill for it, in boardrooms or in alleys. Different weapons, same hunger, and yet, even in this bleak truth, there's a strange kind of redemption. Because if violence is human-made, it can also be human undone. It starts in the smallest acts: a teacher refusing to give up on a child who has no father, a mother working 2 jobs so her son doesn't join the same streets that killed his cousin, a journalist risking her life to tell the story others are too afraid to print. Each of these acts, invisible on their own, form the real resistance. One night in late 2024, a local documentary crew filmed a candlelight vigil in South Central. The camera captured something remarkable: former gang members, police officers, and ordinary residents standing side by side. No speeches, no slogans, just silence. One of the candles flickered and went out, but another hand immediately lit it again. A small gesture, almost nothing, yet in that moment it felt like defiance. A statement: we are still here. We refuse to disappear. The truth is that freedom is not the absence of violence, it's the refusal to surrender to it. Los Angeles may never be completely free of its ghosts, but it can stop feeding them. Redemption doesn't come through denial or force. It comes through memory, through the courage to look at the past without turning away, through accepting that the city's beauty and brutality are inseparable, that both belong to the same story. There's a quote often attributed to James Baldwin: Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Dirt, that's where Los Angeles stands now, staring at its reflection, trembling but unflinching. The war for its soul is not fought in the alleys anymore. It's fought in classrooms, in courtrooms, in living rooms where mothers whisper prayers over sleeping children. As the camera fades to the final sequence, the city stretches out below, endless lights against the darkness, like stars fallen from a broken sky. A narrator's voice echoes softly. Los Angeles has always been a city of dreams. Some built, some broken, some buried. But as long as one light stays burning, the dream survives. The shot lingers. The skyline glows. A faint sound rises, the distant hum of sirens blending with the waves from the Pacific. And in that haunting mix of beauty and pain, the truth becomes clear. Los Angeles will never be entirely saved, but neither will it ever stop trying. Because in this city of angels, even the fallen ones still remember how to fly.